We look to others to guarantee something, and we use that reason as a way to justify our poor commitment with ourselves. What I often find is very interesting is that most people won't even bother to give themselves a try, and they would much rather live this poorly committed life where nothing matters, as if anything else is more interesting. I think that there's a disconnect that we're experiencing in the world, and I notice this even working with my clients, is that we're in a very particular place, and even myself, I want to be able to bring myself closer to this whole thing myself, which is, what is it to be committed? What is it to be connected? And I often notice that we don't even have faith in the thing that we call our humanity. And in fact, we don't believe in it. We just believe in it to be, at a deep, deep level, our experiences of our past. And sometimes it's not quite liberating to hear that, you enjoy being a slave in your whole life, and maybe even the generations behind you enjoy the same thing too. And then maybe you're trying to aspire towards something like freedom and love. It's been a very, very impactful week. What I've been lately interacting with is what I believe to be the source of what causes an individual to be free. Through a lot of my psychological study and even through my practice, I've been able to recognize that our abandonment wounds seem to be a universal wound that I believe we all share. And there isn't a person I haven't met that doesn't have those wounds. And I also believe that that's exactly the very thing that allows you to understand the overarching purpose of your life. There's a certain point I've experienced, especially recently, that what I perceive to be reality consistently continues to change, because the closer I get to truth, I get to feel the miraculous nature of reality. Miraculous, truly miraculous. And I was also able to see that we haven't really made strong commitments to what's most meaningful to us. And because we haven't, we've never got to experience ourselves. Not even once. And the expression is, give yourself a try. And the reason why that's been speaking to me lately is because I realize most people don't give themselves a try. And the beauty of what happens when you start to recognize what you really commit yourself to, and then also what exactly you are connected to, why not let's just start with the most certain place that you could start with, a relationship with yourself. Can you strengthen that commitment, and to think about how deep that will go, and to think about how that will help you expand, and I think even most importantly, to think of how it will get you to connect to your life. And removing a connection from a person's life leaves them to their own vices and their virtues unconsciously. They can't even trust the feelings on their heart or the thoughts in their head. Both of them are aimless, because at the end of it all, you don't have something that meets them both at the same point. And if you eliminate that very thing, and then you could say, well, that's the essence of who you are, then what do you got? Today I'm doing this one solo. Nobody with me, just me and you. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because of how important this has been to me. And what's been so important to me is that I've been able to recognize, if I were to come closer to everything that I call my life, what would it really look like? And I've noticed that it's not a very easy thing to do, because what you're saying to come closer to is a lot of the things that you want to escape. And perhaps it's your melancholy. Perhaps that's your sadness. Perhaps it's your grief. Perhaps it's your loss. Perhaps maybe it's the parts of yourself that you believe can never be loved. Perhaps it's your shadow. What it is to come closer to your life is to be able to recognize that if this human being thing has anything to do with a tree that grows fruits and perhaps maybe offers shade to the people around you, well then you better believe that you're going to need to put yourself in, commit yourself to go deeper with something. And a lot of the times we don't even allow ourselves to see how deep those roots can go. Something I've noticed in my work is that there's an assumption that I think most people have, is that people think. Now, that's not something that happens. It's actually, in fact, you need to be willing to ask yourself things that would deeply challenge you, as you have this round circle debate with a series of versions of yourself, as they all interact with something that challenges every single one of them, until maybe there's something that you have a thought about. Because, you start thinking about what really are your thoughts. Maybe they're just planted ideas or ideologies, and at the end of the day, there's no shortage of that. And so I want to speak to something that could maybe impact your lives, but more than just impact your lives, not only get you to think, but get you to feel, and maybe get you to experience the space that's in between thought and heart, where they both meet at the exact same point. And I believe this to be where a person could really immerse themselves into the soil that they want to build their life in. And so, well, having my business has been pretty interesting, because it's been quite revealing to me that, I can convince them that I'm a cult leader and they'll work for me, or I can, give them the transaction that they're all looking for, but they'll never ask themselves the real question as to why they would dedicate their time to anything that's not meaningful to them. And I often realize that most people waste their time. They spend it in vain with things that don't really matter. And, maybe sure they waste their time in many other ways. Maybe they're getting paid and that's better than wasting your time. Yeah, that's definitely better. You could be not getting paid and wasting your time. But what I do find is very important is that I've noticed more and more that this exists in relationships more than ever, which is expecting a guarantee from others for a commitment you haven't made to yourself. And what I really wanted to talk to is the basis of what it is to have a commitment to yourself if you want to see that commitment be strengthened in the people that you love. Your romantic relationships are going to be the most reflective of your commitment to life. And your commitment to life is nothing short of what your commitment to your life really looks like. To maybe for once, maybe not experience the digital native of your life, which is to experience everything from the third person, but maybe this time to experience it from the first. Experiencing it from the first is the richest experience of your life. It's when you stop trying to have to experience life through the mural that you've been looking through, or the mosaic that you've always been staring at, or the fractal reflections that allow to kind of get a little glimpse of what you think reality is. To experience it as it is means that it constantly surrounds you. It's a constant state of feeling, and perhaps maybe you're leaving yourself vulnerable to what those feelings imply, because maybe if this is life and there's pain, then I'll feel the pain. And there's a subconscious human fear, in fact, to maybe experiencing that pain, and there's a divine desire to experience it, though. And that's where I think most of us start to separate ourselves from what's most binding to our lives is that very experience. If you separate yourself from that, you become a floating head. Separate from your body, your consciousness feels disembodied from you, and that's slavery in a lot of ways. I noticed this myself because I'm really looking for a relationship, and when I say I'm looking for a relationship, I'm realizing the one with myself. And I don't just say that in the cliche way. I'm just talking about, the inevitability of the masculine and feminine existing in every area of our lives, and perhaps maybe existing for you too. And so what does it look like to give yourself a try? And I often notice that people's romantic relationships really show their inner commitments. Because, no two people just get with each other. And, unless they're subconsciously adopting this, a whole list of unaddressed parts of themselves that are making these decisions for them. And then, of course, that's the reason why they're in a relationship. But when a person is able to address those things for themselves, and what they're looking for in a relationship begins to transform, but then also what they're looking for themselves begins to go deeper, right? Because then you start recognizing, well, what is it to expand my life? Is to go deeper with what is most important to me. And that might be a few things, by the way. And what would happen if you fully committed yourself to those few things? And there's a lot of other noise that surrounds you and things that you tell yourself you're like, but the real transformation happens when there's perhaps an obsession with a very thing, and a craft even. And I've noticed this for musicians, and for me working with a lot of musicians, they're some of the most remarkable people in the world, because there's an obsession that's reflective of light that goes in their music, that goes in their relationships, that is in their day to day, that they're breathing, they're living it. And it's like they could run their hands to the soil and they could put it on their arms, and they put it on their face, and they're just obsessed. And I always found this to be very interesting, which is, what is that exactly? And I've noticed that a lot of the time people have created an obsession to avoid a part of themselves. That's not an obsession. What I'm talking about is a deep, deep connection. And the deep connection could be confused for an obsession. And it's a connection with the very thing that for once makes you feel like you're coming closer to the void in your soul. And a lot of the time we like to tell ourselves that that's not the case of our lives. It's like, we all have holes in our soul. And I feel like that for once, maybe you could start recognizing that you're coming here in order to, maybe fill them up. And it's like, well, what do you fill them up? Do you fill it externally? Or maybe it was with the very thing that you are in your life. And, you can kind of see how life has a beginning and an end to it. You have life and then you have death. And there's a whole story that interacts throughout that whole thing. And then maybe you're interacting with these holes, and those things create these desires, and these desires create long, deep longings. But, hey, they make you feel really insecure, because how the hell can I feel something like that? But just in those small steps, it's like you're weaving a stitch and you're running that line through, and you're pulling it to the other side, and you're pulling it closer as the gap gets smaller and smaller. But the whole process of running that line through is fulfillment. And, often we think about fulfillment as just sustaining it and interacting with this constant state. And I've often noticed that a lot of the time when people don't develop a relationship with everything that challenges their peace, they're afraid of it when they are experiencing peace. And people like to reside in their light as they're afraid of darkness, to only be terrified of it as the light begins to diminish it because the darkness surrounds it. We have a lot of these puritanistic ideologies, and unfortunately, they're not reflective of humanity. And if they're not reflective of humanity, you won't connect with them. So you could even say that's true for a relationship. We tell ourselves what we want in a partner, and, we get that thing that we wanted, and my God, it's not rich at all. And you're like, oh, parents are happy, community's happy, I'm miserable. And I made a commitment in my life, and it's to build a family. And I didn't just realize that the commitment was also a commitment that I have here in my business, and it's a commitment that I have in my life. And I'm like, well, what is this commitment towards? And it's like, to live and experience everything that is me. And what I mean by everything that is me is everything outside of the limitations of what are you, which is typically your identities. And I know people that are still trying to be the jiu-jitsu coach of the century, or, the best personal trainer or best bodybuilder, but they're peaking 50, like, oh, okay, slow down. Even Tom Cruise is having a hard time keep up. Well, because, transformation is called to you, and perhaps maybe even the very process of your life allows you to interact and experience more parts of you that could expand your understanding of strength, and courage, and beauty, opposed to it always be condensed into this one thing of what it is. And then the child is forever weak, and the old man is forever weak, and then your 40s are for a little, and so are your 30s, and your 20s are non-existent. And so your whole life becomes either what is at the end or at the beginning, and both of them are being misrepresented because of your juvenile understanding of life. I want to take a moment to slow down, because I swear to God, when this whole connection thing comes up, it wells up. It's like I hit an oil spill. And, maybe I want to go back to that. And I feel like if going back to that would be the most honest thing that I can do, because I feel that, when we talk about connection, I think that we often see a man and a woman, and I feel that's the combination of feminine and masculine. And there's a fulfilling experience to that. And somebody asked me last night, I was at the Magic Castle with friends, and he said, "Do you feel complete?" I said, "I feel fulfilled." No, I don't feel complete. And it was interesting when I said that, as I was able to feel what most people don't allow themselves to experience, and it's perhaps maybe this void. You can come closer to that, and something about being able to experience it is calling of the very thing that you're searching for. It isolates you with it. So this one Sunday I woke up, it's actually just early this week. And when I woke up this Sunday, I was probably feeling more sadness than I've ever felt in my life. Something I spoke about in one of the prior videos, but I'll give you a little bit of context, and it's what integration really looks like. And really the whole purpose of my YouTube is to give you an understanding of what integration really looks like, and using my life as an example, but also being able to give you the tools necessary in order for you to do that in yours. And maybe just to be able to speak to something in your soul that would help you, put your feet in the ground that you want to walk on, and we feel like maybe that's prison. Maybe you could even say this kind of feels like a prison in a lot of ways, and you could even say your own existence does, but that would be diminishing of what it is to experience real freedom, like as if you have an idea of what that looks like. And perhaps maybe this is where you experience things like love and freedom. And so this deep commitment that I made was not just a commitment to a relationship, it was a commitment to myself and how I live my life. And when I recognized that, I often looked to the guarantees of others for maybe people to say so that I can have these things. And I looked for a transaction at the end of the day, because that's what we're used to. And perhaps maybe transactions is an echo of what a connection could really be. But because there's a component of transaction and connection, but there's no connection in transaction. And so you could even say that the transaction is reductive of what connection can offer, because a transaction is not a negative thing. It's just for you to understand. But if you can start understanding that transaction is part of connection, then it expands the very thing, and it serves a purpose. And it serves a purpose that serves the best in each other, that allows them both to make commitments that allow them to strengthen their belief in what they do for themselves. And I often notice that if you remove that from the basis of an individual before they get in a relationship, well, they're not getting in a relationship, they're adopting a tyranny for themselves. And by the way, that's going to be true for anybody. And eventually you'll start looking to that person going, "You're the one ruining my life." And by the way, that's so not reflective of the person either, because you're the one that adopted this kind of tyranny. So maybe you should be asking yourself the question. The Sunday I woke up, and it was more sadness than I ever felt in my life, because I noticed that was not something I allow myself to experience as much of, but I noticed that in a lot of ways, it's the very thing that I'm asking for. I've spoken about my struggle with relationships and connection, and I found that as of recently, the commitment that I had initially made, perhaps for an external pursuit, was one that I really made with myself. And it's one that allows me to strengthen this relationship with everything else that I do. And I notice that everything that comes in the way of that very thing is the fear of what your life would look like if you gave yourself a shot. If we don't make this a conscious effort, the subconscious mechanisms, and that could be even your survival mechanisms, are the ones making the decision. But the problem with it is that you're not experiencing reality. You're experiencing a fantasy, and the fantasy is perfect because you have a grandiose aim on a conscious level, but on a subconscious level, you still love to interact with the juvenile fantasy that doesn't allow you to grow. And there's a real danger to this. is that you can convince other people that you're growing without having grown yourself. And you could start feeding that thing because maybe that's a dysfunction. And you could think of that as a staircase that leads up to a point where it drops right off at the end. And the thing about that staircase is that even when you're at the top that drops off at the end, you don't even have enough courage to walk back down, because then maybe that would imply you went in the wrong direction. And you'll tell yourself it's probably just something you can't see, and then you step into the void and it consumes you. A lot's coming to me at the moment. And because, I'm giving myself to do it. And usually I'm afraid of doing this kind of stuff because the camera for me always isolates me with my own thoughts, and there's new ones that come up that are contrary with what I thought I was going to say, and it's almost never the thing that I thought I was going to sit down and talk about. The freedom that we're looking for is in a commitment that we make to ourselves, that is in service of everything that is our life. So it has a selfish duality to it, as in, this is your life, the thing that you're looking to do, and you're looking to serve that at the highest level possible. And maybe you're open to an expansion of what that is to serve yourself. And then to an extension of that service to yourself is the one thing I believe exists in all human beings, is to serve others. And that's something that we desire to do, but you can't skip the steps of selfishness before you get there. So when I woke up this Sunday, it was very interesting because I was noticing how a lot more of this commitment, and what is this, a commitment to my heart and to everything that I feel on my heart. And, opening up to emotions has been something interesting, because I noticed that if you open up to emotions, you're opening up to a part of yourself. So maybe you're opening up to your heart. And so you could say that, there's a mental consciousness that people need to wake up to. There's no question about it. But then there's also an emotional one. And what I find is very interesting is that the one thing that God asks for you is, I want all of your heart, all of your soul, and all that you possess. And there's something interesting about the entirety of our being and dedication to God. And I find that to be deeply powerful, because what it's talking about is that you have an aim of your life. And actually, in fact, the way that you live your life and the things that are the most meaningful to you are the things that you could be diving into the most. And you could be dedicating all of those things to that. And then you could be alive. I think we're all artists. There's an artist in everyone. And it's just a question of whether or not they want to be able to open themselves up to that dialogue that allows them to live for the reasons that they never thought that they really lived for. And you could say that I think there's this poor imagination that people tell themselves they do these things because they're afraid. And it's like, the reason why you haven't made these commitments is because you don't trust others. And it's like, I'm beginning to think you haven't even bothered to start with that commitment that you can make to yourself and to what's important to you. You haven't even started with the most important question: why? Why did I do these things? What is the purpose of this? Why do I even speak to the camera? Why is it that I even hire the employees to go ahead and go do this thing? It's like, sure, I need to make a job, but there's a certain point where that very thing of I need to make a living and there's things that I'm good at has transformed into something like, no, I'm part of a much larger purpose. And maybe I could speak to the people in my business and I could tell them that very thing, that maybe they're interacting with that higher purpose. And for somebody that has a deep abandonment wound, they're like, oh my God, there hasn't been a point where somebody hasn't left at some point. And it's like, well, who's really in control of that? And so when I'm talking about this deep commitment and this immersion into these waters, it's like my head is going completely under. And when you keep swimming, it's almost like, you're going down a mine shaft. And you have to start thinking about what would it be like for you in order to continue with this commitment to yourself. And it's like, well, what is this commitment to yourself? It's like, okay, you're crawling. And the walls are getting closer and closer. And as you go deeper, it starts to get narrower. But then as it starts to get narrower, you start to experience a lot of fear of everything that stops you from what's most important to you. And so you have to be able to identify what's most important to you, or else you'll be somebody that always kisses everybody's asses. And I've noticed this about us getting older and maturing. It's not that I don't care anymore. It's just I care far more about things that are important to me. And that maybe gives the illusion of my disinterest in other things, but what's really important to me is so damn important to me. All of my heart is in it. So when I woke up this Sunday, I recognized that a commitment to my life is a commitment to these experiences. And my whole life, my relationships have been mainly coping of the experience of my life. And I've always experienced that because I noticed that, and this is a harsh reality that you'll experience in relationships if you've had a few, is that everything that you're experiencing prior to that person goes out the window and you experience this nice little steady climb. But then somewhere around 3 to 6 months, you start recognizing that it has diminishing returns. It's not moving as fast as it once did. And then it plateaus. And then maybe it holds a line, but that's a line that could satisfy you for a little bit. And that's a dangerous line that could satisfy you. So there's nothing wrong with not being satisfied. You just got to recognize that you got to do something about it. And then there's a certain point where it starts to trickle away and you start to give it more gas, and that gas starts to become in vain. You start to pour into that person, but they got holes, and they start to pour into you and you got holes. And you find yourself back at the bottom, the one place you're the most afraid of. It's the one thing that allows you to recognize how real your commitments are and what exactly you're connected to. And a lot of the time, we don't even want to have that conversation of what we're connected to, because that whole thing would be too challenging to the lie that you live that you call your life. I woke up that one morning. It was like hitting oil. There was so much motion. And the way I've used relationships before was a way to cope, the way to avoid those experiences. And it was interesting because I've been focusing a lot on being able to integrate the protective mechanisms collectively with the essence. And it's like, it's mind and heart working together. It's the two brothers that were separated. Maybe there was an initial hatred, kind of like Esau and Jacob, and then they come back together in a loving embrace. Sometimes we forget that the story is there for you, for your life, your whole life, constantly relevant. And so the way that I would use relationships before would be everything that was me and my commitments to life, I would put in this sliding door, this window sliding door, and then I'd be able to experience that little kick bump into a high. And then I would use that as a way to continue to further myself from me. Because I realized giving yourself a try is insane. What you're starting to learn, especially when you start to give yourself a try, is that every single inadequacy and insecurity, and perhaps maybe even every single wound that you've experienced, which would definitely call to the feelings of powerlessness that you probably feel, will then maybe make you realize, for once, if you went down to the level that they require you to go down to, which most people wouldn't even bother to do, you would see what's important to you. And when there's the thing that you love most, and your heart drives you to it, and there's hellfire that surrounds it, why do you walk through? You walk through because it's so damn worth it. I would keep them at a distance, and that distance would allow me to, be able to interact with all the other performances of my life that could allow me to interact with a relationship that never really satisfies me, because I realize that what it is to meet your needs is to meet your needs, capital U. And a lot of the time we don't even know what that is. And so we often tell ourselves these are the things that we want. And I've played that game before, and it's a dangerous game to play. Such a dangerous game to play because you haven't even discovered who you are, and then to discover what your needs are with who you are is an incredibly challenging experience to even address, because maybe you've been a fuck up your whole life. Why would you want to have that conversation with you? Well, that very conversation is healing, because at least it's opening the door to upward progression. The alternative is just the inevitable downward one. And that's most people's decisions. They don't even know it. They just put themselves in a position to where they can only make one decision always. They haven't opened up to the terrors of actually aiming upwards, because it's far more terrifying than everything you're familiar with. So for me, it was very interesting, because I would notice that whenever I would feel these feelings of loneliness or sadness or even grief, it would be like, okay, perfect. If I find a girl to interact with, and all of those things disappear. And then I also recognized, if you aren't going to make a commitment to your life, you'll be with somebody who's as committed to making sure that never happens. And really another way of saying that is you'll be committed to somebody who's committed to making sure you don't become the best version of yourself. And I see that all the time, and it's like, they have to battle the person that they're with, and I recognize it's because they battle that within themselves, the commitment to what's most important to them, as to why they're here, and to maybe experience a life that constantly speaks to them. And we would like this kind of whole reality, which is what we forget. We like the whole reality to where we don't exist with the miracles, where we don't exist with the wonders, where we don't exist with the signs. There's a reason why we like it. This is what we've known our whole lives, and not just us, the generations that came before us. It's the Jews in Egypt. 400 years a slave, 400 years an enslaved generation. Took them 40 years to recognize the promised land was right in front of their face. And what was interesting is that they wandered for 40 years in the desert as the fucking land was 2 blocks away. And it was like they couldn't receive it. It was like, they were so lost in their own ways, of their own understandings, of their own gods and their own generations. And it's like, I want you to wake up to something that maybe a commitment to your life is not just you working through what you have experienced in your life. It's the generations that have come before you, and you could take these forward steps, and you could heal the past, and you could change your life, and you could expose yourself to wonder. And that could be your life. It could be better than you could ever imagine. And that's the thing that's actually terrifying to us, is that that's a possibility that it could get more beautiful than you could have ever imagined. And it's just a question of how committed you are to your life. And I noticed it was Sunday, and it was interesting to me because I've noticed that being able to experience emotions is deeply sobering. And what's so sobering about it is you get to see people, and you get to see people suffer, and you accept your own suffering. And you don't just accept your own suffering, you start to experience your own pain. And that takes you even deeper to the commitment of, why would I go deeper with this? Because this is everything I've trained myself to avoid. And it's like, well, that makes sense. If you were a slave, you would do exactly that. You would find a way back into the prison that you told yourself you wanted to escape. And, well, you get closer and closer and closer, and it gets heavier and heavier and darker and darker. Feels like a descent into madness. Well, to me, that was freedom. It's freedom because for the first time I realized what it is to be committed to my life, and to see how much courage it takes to give myself a try. So on that Sunday, it was like I woke up and the whole of my soul, and I was able to sit with that and experience it, and it fulfilled me. And being able to experience it took me to a place that I've never been before. And I'll tell you what happened, and it was very interesting because I noticed that I wanted to escape. I wanted to run from it. I didn't want to sit there. I didn't want to experience it. And I thought of, calling a bunch of girls because that'll work. And, well, that's been my coping mechanism for years. It's like, if I experience these things, then I can go to a woman. I don't need to experience them until you hang out with that woman long enough and you experience all of those things with the woman. That's double the despair, right? Because there's no hope anymore. You're left with the same thing that you were too much of a coward to address at first. And now you're in too deep with this one person. And now maybe you tell yourself that that person could unlock something that could save you. Not only is that manipulative, it's highly narcissistic and delusional about what you're really looking for. And it's completely inconsiderate to others because it has nothing to do with them. So I thought about, I had my whole list. I even wrote it down as I was journaling. And I woke up and I said, I want to give this person a call, this person a call, this person a call, and this person a call. And before I even wrote down those things, I wrote down what I really wanted. And I wanted to be held. And I wanted to be held in a way that allowed me to embrace and experience these experiences. And it was something that I wrote down. It was to cry together. And then when I wrote down the fantasy of just, getting that quick phone call in, which is also funny, all of those girls were out of town, is the second I realized that I was more comfortable with just calling someone who would never really meet the need, that would give me the little cigarette dopamine hit that would allow me to get to the next checkpoint. And we create lily pads from the water we need to go deep into. And we all tell ourselves we're growing, but you're jumping from one lily pad to the next in a circle of the water that you need to submerge yourself into. And then you might even go, well, why would I submerge myself into that? It's so isolating. Why the hell would I commit myself to these things? It's so isolating. Why would I become who I am? It's so isolating. Your whole life, you've been trained to be other people. Your whole life, you've made yourself someone you're not. Your whole life, you've hidden from every single gift you have. Your whole life, you've separated yourself from your reality. Your whole life, you've separated yourself from your love. Your whole life, you've separated yourself from your sex even. And it's like, what's the one thing that we all want? It's like, well, I want a connection to my sexuality. I want a connection to my life. I want a connection to my presence. I want a connection to the people around me. I want a connection to my gifts. I want to come closer. And when you think about a commitment is coming closer to the initial thing that sets you free, because the whole process of freedom is something that constantly expands, that you constantly immerse yourself into, that eventually allows you to experience something that's transcended. And that transcended experience that you have sets you free. And that actually, the experience itself is where the freedom is. Because, you completely condense that into just the physical reality. It's like, well, then you're still limited by the physical reality and what that has to offer. So this is the only way through if you really want to experience freedom. And so, even in myself, as I continue to talk about this, I get to feel like, it's like you're putting your head into that whole thing. And so it was that Friday I met this girl, and I noticed that as I met that girl, I was going to go into Shabbat, and Shabbat was going to bring up all of those emotions. And I was like, perfect, she's going to be the perfect hang-up, because I know that if I go into Shabbat, it's going to be very, very lonely. I'm going to feel very, very sad. But it was so funny when I was talking to the girl, I was like, this ain't it. This ain't it. This ain't it. My soul could feel that too. And it's like, well, the next Sunday, the Shabbat that I experienced, I was definitely at a distance. And then when I wrote down what I really wanted, which was to be held, and it was to experience that embrace and to cry together and to connect together, the fantasy that I created was everything that avoided the thing that I really wanted. And there was a certain point where even that part of me was like, a real relationship is not the removal of these experiences, but the amplification of it. If you've made a commitment to your life, then everything that you have in your life is only going to be amplified the closer you come to it. Now, this starts getting you closer to the reason as to why you live your life. And that question will be a question that will allow you to swim into the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean and the ocean of your potential. And we never really get to find the thing that can actually make an impact on the world, because there's a certain point where as you go deeper, it requires you to let go of everything that stops you from coming closer to what's most meaningful to you. So I just recorded the other video that you probably saw last week, an hour away from this one, because I was definitely in my head with it. And there's no question about it, I definitely was, because, it was the whole psychology thing. I recognize that that wasn't what really needs to drive the point. I want to speak from the heart for this one. And I'm going to use a different kind of language. And I'm going to use the language of how the heart really communicates. And so what I was really talking about, and this is what I really wanted to share, is that I'm learning faith. There's this assumption that I've had faith. And let's be real, that's a big assumption. Let's actually think of it this way. The greatest crucible of your life, and what it is to become a gladiator, is to struggle with what it is to live with faith. The movie Hacksaw Ridge was probably one of the most impactful films of my life. Well, I'm being a little dramatic when I say that, but I think that what was really impactful about the film was a person being armed with faith. And I also thought about what kind of strength it takes to be somebody who lives with faith. And then, we often talk about it as maybe a delusional kind of cope, and let's get rid of that whole idea of hope. And the reason why I say let's get rid of it is because it's cheap. It's not what you're looking for. And it's like, well, you want to taste the flavor of life. Well, then put your teeth into faith. Put it into belief. And I mean it. It's like you're immersing yourself into waters that were viciously terrifying you and chasing you. And then this time, you're submersing yourself into what is the experience of your life. I spoke a lot about my current relational state with myself, and also what I've been experiencing in the dating scene, and what I thought to be the most important part of everything that I shared from last week, and I think even more important what I'm going to get into today. The reason why you do what you do is not because you're afraid of not getting what you need from others. And now this is a lie that you tell yourself, and it's because you refuse to address your vulnerabilities, and your vulnerabilities are the gateways to your soul. Now, they're also in the places that make you feel the most terrified. So you need to be thinking of it this way. You want to have a relationship with God. Show up for one. Show that you want one. And you might go, well, no, what has he showed me? Does he even exist? Do I even want this? And I don't even want to get into the theological conversation, but I do want to speak freely. I do want to speak from my heart. I do want to talk about the very dance that we have in our souls that is the reason as to why we live. And it's a spark. And it's a spark, and you can grow that. And you can grow that through a commitment. And you could bind that commitment, and you can get it stronger. And you could think of it this way. What exactly is faith? It's coming closer to the truth of your life. And as you get closer and closer, you wrap it a little bit tighter. And you wrap it a little bit tighter. And actually, what I'm doing here right now is actually a very powerful religious Jewish tradition where you wrap tefillin, right? And I always found that to be very compelling, because what you're taking is the weaker side of you, the left side, and you're binding it to what? And it's like, well, it's towards your highest purpose. And I always find it to be interesting is it's not just your weaker side, but I mean, that's how they would quantify it. But it's actually through the opposition. It's the part of you that you struggle fighting with the most. And perhaps maybe if you can direct that towards what best serves you, then it's no longer something you need to run from, and you can be free. And so I believe that God at the core of him has this embodiment of freedom, and understanding of what he is and who he is reflective of who you are and where you want to be. And I always felt that to be very important. This connection a person can develop. And you could develop that connection with your life if you're willing to come closer to the truth of it. And you could say, well, the truth of it is maybe not the prettiest thing at first, right? And it typically won't, but the whole process of it is incredibly fulfilling. And you might even notice that it's meaningful, but you might not be the person that you tell yourself you want it to be just yet. It's a rich sensation, a rich feeling to feel like you're committed, but also to feel like you're involved, to feel like you're connected. It's more about the dance and working things out through the dance. And the best way that I can describe it to you of what it feels like to have a connection is that there's a kind of like a dance, the two sparks existing more as one, dancing within you at the deepest level of your being. And you'll never be able to discover that light or to be able to grow it if you're not willing to be able to go into the deepest, darkest parts of yourself. And I continue to stress this. And the reason why I stress this is because the very thing that has helped you at any point in your life has been exactly in those places, but your commitment is weak, so why do you stop looking where it matters most? And so then this brought me back to the previous video, which was I was talking a lot about, just more things just to kind of give you a grasp of it, but this will be really the part 2 of that. What is faith? How do you learn it? What exactly does that look like? And well, I had a really powerful experience between this video and the last one. And it was just, I went out for a walk. I took care of some work calls. And as I was on my walk, I saw an old high school friend with a new friend of his. And it was interesting. I was deeply drawn to them. And, you know, when people tell themselves they need to make things happen, that's also part of the illusion of you lacking faith. And before I even get into the story, I wanted to get into the importance of addressing your vulnerabilities. And it comes into a certain point where your abandonment wound could show you freedom. And you're like, well, why do people stay? What's the reason to people's connection? Why are two people brought together? Why are you here? And, you know, that might be contrary to this worldview that you've consistently continued to build up. And by the way, you're going to integrate all of it. Because there's no such thing as wasting your life, especially if you're somebody who's willing to show up for all of it and even willing to go back to the places where most people wouldn't, so you can be given a chance. And I'll tell you what he shared with me, because it was so damn powerful. As I go to walk the street, I thought I was going to say hi to them. They're going this way. I'm crossing this way. They already walked ahead of me. My light turns red. He's there with his friend, and they're talking with each other. Their light turns green. But they didn't walk. They kept talking. And then I catch up to them, and I say hi to my high school friend. As I say hi to my high school friend, I see this guy, and he looks me in the eyes. He's an older guy, 33. And he goes, "You look like a man who's beginning to believe in God." I just smiled. I put my arm over his shoulder, and I said, "Yes, sir, on the money, dead on, you split an arrow." And he continues to tell me a little bit about his story and his development and how he's working on that himself. And you could say, well, that's quite miraculous. And he was talking about what it is to return to this place to where you can actually have faith is something so interesting, because you can start recognizing what faith really is. It's knowing. And it's a fancy word. You know, when I talk about knowing, I'm not talking about knowledge. I'm talking about when a person lives with the belief, it's not just like a certainty of its inevitability. And I feel like people confuse that with conviction. It's like, well, how about try this? And it's like a dance that you're working through. And you can kind of work it out. And you're actually finding that you're in this little mojo of sorts. And it's revealing to you of more. And you find yourself in it. As in, it's not just so much this answer or this revelation you were looking for. And he told me something. And he said, you know, my biggest fault when it came to faith was that I was waiting for God to show me something, when he would only remove my faith and my free will by doing that. And so then I was like, wait, so there needs to be a conscious, voluntary effort to even look for the thing that you can continue to grow and commit. Well, yeah. That's why it's really important to even take the first step, to give yourself a try, which is what I spoke about in the other video. And it's like, wow, man, if you give yourself a try, you'll be able to experience the richness of your soul. And I promise you, once you get a taste, you'll never stop going deeper. And then it made me realize something, is that, like, did I make that conversation happen? Did I go out of my way to do it? What was I trying to control there? And I've always had that insecurity in my whole life. It was like, I got to get people to show up. I got to get people to stay. I got to make sure I can control this thing and get this outcome. And it's interesting that we have two frameworks that we have in this world that's completely feed that or completely neglect that exists. But what about the one where you integrate that? And it's like, well, the integration of it means that through that very thing, there's a dialogue that's communicating the exact thing that you need to set yourself free. And then you could say, well, then your ego kind of comes in there and paints little stories about what's going to happen if you do. So this is already the beginning of the dance. And this is the thing that's interesting about emotions. Well, it's a dimension of yourself, and it provides you clarity, and it gives you feeling. And you could even say, if I listen to a song right now, and it spoke to you, and it made you move, and it made you see, then you're getting in touch with it. And it's interesting. You could just get on your Spotify playlist, and you could play a song that makes you feel. And then you're like, well, why is that so powerful? And it's like, well, because maybe for once it's actually allowing me to expand myself in areas I typically wouldn't go, or to feel something I typically wouldn't feel, or to allow myself to experience what art does to a person, as it gets them closer to what the artist is experiencing themselves, that they express through their art and share. And that fulfills them. And he tells me, the biggest lie I've ever told myself is that I wanted him to reveal myself to me, because that would have been somebody who's neglecting me. That would have been a God who's neglecting me. And I thought about the great way to neglect children is to give them the thing that they tell themselves they want, not the thing that they need, because what they really need is to develop strength. And you can give that to people by allowing them to understand that they have that within them. A lot of the time we look for a logistical how, right? Oh, the beginning of all kind of, how do I do that? How do I do that? Like, how about you start with your commitment to what's important to you? And if you could start recognizing that that's a truth about reality, the how will reveal itself. And in fact, maybe you'll experience the adventure of your life that will unravel the how for you. And guess what? It will line up with reality. It won't be something you have to reject. It actually will expand your perception of reality and allow you to recognize the wonders that exist within it. And I always thought about this whole thing. It's like, well, why doesn't God just reveal himself? Why isn't there just a big thunderbolt from heaven or whatever we think that it would be? And it's like, my God, you think that that's going to open you up? Oh, I mean, you'll bury it and hide it in every single way possible. And if you do, and maybe if you have a very high intellect, you'll make it something that it's not. And you won't even believe in whatever that thing is. And it's like something so interesting. The whereabouts by where we go to look at it is actually not what impacts you. And this is something that I notice, is that if it's not an internal connection with that very thing to develop faith in, then it's empty. And we often try to think that the external reality will actually offer you anything. It's like, you can never run away from your problems, and neither can you run away from your gifts. And maybe if you understood that, then maybe you would dwell with both because they're one and the same. And it was something I heard the other day when we went to the Magic Castle for my friend's birthday, and it was, if you don't have any vices, you don't have any virtues. And, well, that spoke to me because it made me realize, well, yeah, if you don't have any problems, probably don't have any gifts. And what I find to be interesting is that what is a perceivable problem at first begins to unravel itself into the very thing you've been looking for the whole time. The whole process of discovery is not an external search and not a means to an end. It's not a dysfunction you feed until you get to the top of it and die. It's the discovery of what has existed inside you always. There are desires that are planted. There are dreams that are given. There are families that you were raised in. There's a world that you're in. And these things you might think that you're against all odds, and that's actually a good point. And I don't want you to ever think that you're not against all odds, because you are. Your life is a shot at the dark. But if you're willing to go deep enough, and you're willing to be able to see the spark in your soul that dances, then maybe you'd be willing to find the thing that's in you that defies all odds. When I think of connection now at this point in my life, I'm beginning to realize that, I'm beginning to believe. I'm beginning to believe in God. I never knew what it felt like. But I'm beginning to realize that once I decided to give myself a chance, myself a try, I don't need to do this all on my own. I never did.